And Herbert has been crusading pretty hard against the Bush administration abuses in the war on terror. And in the current piece, he's doing it again. Nothing wrong with that. You know, I'm against abuses myself. But the very last paragraph in the piece caught my eye. Because in it he says, and I'm quoting here, "A lot of Americans are like spoiled rich kids who take their wealth for granted. Too many of us have forgotten, or never learned, the real value of the great American ideals," he writes. "Too many are standing silently by as Bush and his cronies engage in the kind of tyrannical and uncivilized behavior that has brought so much misery and ultimately ruin to previous societies," unquote. And I couldn't help but think, wait a minute, Mr. Herbert. It's the liberal New York Times crowd that has destroyed the teaching of the sorts of things in our schools that would have made our kids more aware of the American ideals that you're now worried about. You know, this is, I gotta say, folks, this is a very sore spot with me when I start going down this road, because I was a history major in college, and I'm a history lover, right? So I take it personally when people twist history for their own uses. But just so you know, almost everyone does. There is no monopoly on twisting history for your own uses. What the left has done in America, since the 1950s, actually, but, you know, we associate a lot of it with changes in the 1960s. What the left has done to history education in America is a direct contributor to why Americans today don't value the ideals of the Founding Fathers. Because, you know, and I've said this a million times. I think we did a show in the Classic Common Sense season where we got into this as well. But we are an ideological society in America, ladies and gentlemen. By that I mean most societies are racial and cultural societies. That's the norm. I have a history book my mom gave me when we lived in England a little while I was about 4 or 5 years old. Okay, so I've been reading history for a while. And what was fascinating about the history book you bought in Great Britain is it goes back to caveman times. It's just a history of Great Britain, but it starts out in caveman times. And then they go from there to like the Celts, you know, and then the Romans. And I'm thinking the difference between American history and British history is ours starts with guys in, you know, powdered wigs and stuff. That's the beginning of our history book. The British history book, they start in caves. That's why you're British, right? Excuse me, this is really English. That's why you're English. You're English because you live in England. And your ancestors have been here since cave times, and that's why you're English. There's an Englishness that comes with, you know, living there, having those genes, having that culture, that kind of thing. Most countries fall into that category. But there are other countries that are based on other things. I mean, the Soviet Union, the now defunct ex-Soviet Union, was an ideological society, right? The ideology was Marxism. That was how that culture, society, country organized itself, right? A principle, a doctrine that governed everything else, from economics to private life, right? To its dealings with other nations. Because it was an ideological society, they taught the ideology all the time. You didn't just have a class on Marxism every day in school. Every class you had was somehow tied into Marxism. They brought Marxism into the language. I mean, everything was Marxism, right? The reinforcement to the young people of the concept of the very thing that unified them as a country. We're not unified by race or culture or history. We're unified by this idea. The United States, ladies and gentlemen, is an ideological society. We are unified by an idea. The idea is freedom. The idea is liberty, right? We don't teach that, though. And then people like Bob Herbert become appalled when we don't know it and we don't value it. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, Dan, we do teach this stuff, don't we? I mean, there are classes on the Constitution and stuff. Like I said, ladies and gentlemen, the Marxists didn't just teach Marxism in one class every day, which we never have done with freedom and liberty. They taught it every day in every course. I'm not suggesting we go there. But wouldn't it be great if the kids had one course on American ideals every year of their lives past a certain grade? I know people are going, well, that sounds excessive to me. Well, really? Mr. Herbert might not think so now. when you start to realize that understanding what this country is about is the number one prerequisite to being a good citizen, then you start to realize what the downside is if you don't focus on that at some point during someone's education in an ideological society. It's like, you hear people say all the time, well, we need to teach values in school. But nobody can agree on the values, right? Do we want to teach Christian values? We want to teach, there's obviously a lot of disagreement on that. But why can't we agree that we should be teaching kids about freedom and liberty and the values that the founders thought important and all that stuff? Why isn't that something we can at least, who's against that? Well, people like Bob Herbert at times. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Two examples, one from my own life and one from otherwise. The example from my own life is what I was in college when this whole idea of PC history, I'll call it, was huge. Still huge. I remember walking into a class once that I had to take for my major on British history, right? And the teacher strode in the first day and explained that this was going to be a class on British women in history. And I had to go after class to her and say, excuse me, I need this course as part of my history knowledge. There's going to be things I have to learn here that are going to come up later. But later, they're not going to be focusing on British history. They're going to want me to know about Hastings in 1066, the Great Fire of London, the Spanish Armada, the history stuff that most people in history expect you to know. And she said, it's my prerogative. This is an underappreciated and understudied area of history, and it would be good for you, Dan Carlin, to learn about it. And I said, yes, ma'am. If I'm a British history major, I better have a course on British women in history. But I'm not. This is a course I have to get to the next level of history. Didn't matter, folks. There's an ideology at work here. Here's the other example. I live in a pretty liberal town, college town, by the way. And there are people here who just hate dead white guys. There was a letter to the editor in the local paper here once from a high school history teacher who identified himself and the school he taught at, where he said in the letter that he would not teach his students about dead white slaveholders. Those were his words. Now, a couple things go on here. The first thing is, how the heck do you teach American history without teaching about dead white slaveholders? Heck, they wrote the Constitution. If you don't teach about them, you don't teach about the Constitution. You don't teach about the Constitution, Americans don't know about the ideals of freedom and liberty, and then they get Bob Herbert writing about him in the New York Times. How do you not make that connection? By the way, blew me away that not only would someone write a letter like that, but they would put their name, and that they would put their school where they taught, and they were confident enough that the society who was going to read this letter to the editor would be comfortable enough with this guy saying he wouldn't teach anything about dead white slaveholders, that he wouldn't have to worry about his job being threatened. He wouldn't have to worry about a backlash. Are you kidding? Most people in this town don't want me to teach about dead white slaveholders. Folks, you don't teach about the dead white slaveholders, and you get people who don't care about freedom and liberty. Why? Because the two are intimately related. One of the great ironies of history, that the men who wrote a constitution that left women as non-voters, counted African Americans as 3/5 of a person, still turns out to be the great emancipation document for all of us, right? Got to teach about those dead white slaveholders, don't you? Well, the whole PC history thing is robbing our children because we won't teach about the ideology. The ideology is freedom and liberty. Ladies and gentlemen, you teach the ideas of the Founding Fathers today, and that's controversial. What's that great line? I think it was Charles Austin Beard who said it. But to be considered a dangerous radical these days, you need only run around the streets spouting off the sayings of the Founding Fathers. Murdered that actual quote. But you get the drift of it. What the Founding Fathers thought, ladies and gentlemen, is controversial. Teaching it in schools is controversial. And when you get people who think teaching anything about dead white slaveholders is bad and they won't do it, how are your kids going to get the kind of history they need to be good citizens in an ideologically based society? And the answer is, they can't. What's the solution? It's pretty simple, isn't it? Let's take the Bob Herbert's arguments that he's making in this piece, by the way, entitled Fight Against Tyranny Starts Here at Home. It sure does, Mr. Herbert. Let's start it here at home. And the first class I would make all these kids take is Dead White Slaveholders 101.